understand which US you're entering into and why that US. Because every now and then we enter these conversations with clients or friends who are anticipating moving to the US, and they ask me the question, when should we be moving to the US? And I often say, well, which one? We have 50 USs here, and they're all different. And you got to choose carefully, because for you and your particular product or your service, it can really hurt you going into a different US.
Patrick De Orr here, co-founder at Visa Franchise. Excited to have on a good friend and colleague, Kjell De Orr. Kjell is an expert on everything marketing, market research, and particularly today's conversation is something that's very dear to his life's work, and that's market entry. So he's done that in Europe, he's done that in the US, he's done that in many different markets. And the focus today is on all things US market entry. At Visa Franchise, we've been bringing different companies to the United States, doing basic incorporation, EIN, business bank account, the business plan for visa purposes, filing the visa with the external attorney. But we don't roll up our sleeves and do very thorough market research. That's not what we do. We bring in experts like Kjell. So Kjell, thanks so much for joining us today.
No, pleasure. Thank you, Patrick, for having me.
And I know we met back in Miami, I guess it's like 12 years now, 13 years ago, where you were the CEO of a pretty large operation in the voting, polling, market research space. Could you just tell me a little bit about your trajectory and kind of how your experience has formed, where you've really cemented yourself as an expert for all things U.S. market entry?
Yeah, sure. I always kind of cringe when people call themselves experts, because we all call each other experts now and then. But yeah, do we know everything just because we're an expert? No, we know more than others. That's pretty much it, right?
That's well said.
But yeah, where do we start? I've been working 30 plus years in business consulting. The start was within a global company. We operated in a large number of countries at the same time for the same customers. So it gave me early on in my career exposure to a large swathe of geographies and different markets. And our expertise was really working on global scale. So I still remember one of the first accounts I worked on and led was 110 countries, which meant, you visit each country, you work with the senior management in each country and so on. And I think from there on, I've been leading different organizations, global organizations in the analytics, in the strategy, in the transformation, market innovation space, and so on. And as time goes, I've now worked in 6 continents. I've lived in 5 continents. I still have Antarctica to live and work in, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, it's been quite a long journey. In 2010, I moved to the US. I had already before then been managing as CEO a couple of company operations here in the US, but more as remote, as part of a global sort of mandate. And so I would do things like spend 2 weeks in the US, 2 weeks in Europe, and split my time and work that way. And I look back and in those days, and I thought I knew more than I think I know now, in the sense that we thought many times in those days, at least, that we knew enough to establish successfully US operations. We had fairly substantial resources. In many cases, we'd go in, we'd acquire, merge, acquire, and keep on establishing our market presence. But many times we look back and we say, well, we could have done things differently had we known. And I think that's a classic example of how many times we I say broadly, conduct international business. We think we know a region, or we think we know a market sufficiently. We go in, and maybe 5-10 years later, we look back and we say, well, we did some big whoppers there, because we didn't really realize the importance of X, Y, Z.
Kjell, what are some things that you really need to get right with the US, or it could be fatal? When we're talking about you're opening up the business, you're expanding, and if you don't hit these things right, you might be closing down shop after a couple of years.
Yeah, I think I think there's so many things. When you're establishing a new market presence, it's not just one or five things. It's all of the above. It runs the gamut from, the first people that you hire and they set the tone and the culture of what follows, to the founders and investors and their experience and past experience in working in that market, and their beliefs and thoughts on that, what needs to be done, the connectivity that you have in terms of connections and ability to have market access and introductions, economic climate. I mean, I've been in cases where everything is aligned perfectly. It's beautiful. It's gonna work, and suddenly you have, could be an international incident that puts the hold on the optimism, and suddenly everyone's a little bit more cautious and spending is being pulled back and decisions take longer, and suddenly everything changes again. So there can be macro issues that are completely out of your hand. But for US in particular, I would say understand which US you're entering into and why that US. Because every now and then we enter these conversations with clients or friends who are anticipating moving to the US, and they ask me the question, so when should we be moving to the US? And I often say, well, which one? We have 50 USs here, and they're all different. And you got to choose carefully, because for you and your particular product or your service, it can really hurt you going into a different US. So go to Texas, and that could be an absolute success or a total blowout on failure for one to another. So choose carefully, do your homework on. Don't think you're going to the US. You're going to a state, one state or two states or three states.
And how would you compare like Florida to Texas? And I know you've done some work too with governmental agencies where
Yeah,
sometimes there's tax benefits, grants for setting up your business in Texas, for example. Can you
exactly.
comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's part of the parcel of which US you're connecting with, because not only are the states very different, I think investors are very different from state to state. I think expectations, market expectations, and investor expectations are very different from state to state. Talent, very different from state to state. And of course, the market is also very different. But on top of that, just as you mentioned here, working with different states' economic development teams, the conditions, if you were to find more or less two similar states, that can be the tipping point of, what tax breaks you can get, what kind of additional investments, soft money you get, access to different types of staffing, different types of housing, and different types of office and equipment, etc., etc. It can really be a very large difference, even within states. I mean, within the states, the different counties compete quite aggressively for companies to come and establish themselves. So sometimes we end up in a toss up where we're basically asking the same state to just tell us where if you have a preference, because we're getting very different bids from different counties, and different mayors are pulling at companies and wanting them in their own back.
And what type of company should like consider that? A company that's going to hire, 10 people, 100 people in the next 5 years. When does it make sense to really start evaluating these governmental benefits, whether it's tax breaks, grants, etc.?
Yeah, it's always tied into a bigger story, right? So depending on where that mayor or that county is looking to build expertise and a market presence. So it could be a smaller company, but it falls within the bucket of, for example, green tech. They are really intent on building out the green tech ecosystem within that county. So even a small company can then come in and negotiate. But usually it's the bigger numbers that play in, right? The number of FTEs that they will be hiring in the first, second, and third year, how much office space they will be hiring and implementing into their organization. I mean, how much investment is coming with their presence and so on. So usually the bigger numbers of FTEs, the bigger numbers of investments, bigger numbers of space and housing that they're taking up, the more attractive and the better the opportunity to negotiate something even more attractive.
And Shell, what are some ways that companies can use data analytics, digital transformation in terms of optimizing and making the transition stateside or the opening up of the US operations that much easier?
That's a really good question because where does it start and where does it stop, right? So analytics, digital transformation today is I operate in a space where all the companies I work with are AI, data driven, platform driven. So it's all we do, right? So we really focus on that. Very few product companies that we work with. So for us, when we look at broader entities that operate, for example, a product specific company, we see the opportunity to work with a more proactive management of the business, much more in real time or even predictive, and therefore kind of anticipating events that you can manage much more for the company's benefit in time. And it doesn't need to take you by surprise. You've seen that coming, you've had time to prepare, and you're already kind of and proactively preempting what that means for you. So for us, using digital tools and using data and analytics is not just about reading customer preferences and seeing how customers are changing their buying behaviors, introducing new products and services on the back of that analysis, and innovating and staying at the cusp of being the cutting edge companies that are providing the best product and service and package. But it's also looking at using the analytics on a larger scale, looking for where you can switch up your own operations in a way that you might be looking for a better service or better product at a cheaper price point. If you're running without analytics, you don't really have time to think about it. You don't really have time to anticipate that and see what that modeling can do for your business and then make the decision. You often do it a bit more ad hoc, a bit more random. Maybe somebody mentioned it to you and you thought that sounded great, I'll give it a go. Or you might actually not have time to even look into it because it sounds interesting, but what does that really mean for your business? Whereas with today's AI and modeling opportunities, you can actually very quickly see what that actually means for your business and whether that's a good switch for you to make, and then make the decision.
And when does it make sense to make that move to the US? Because we have a lot of clients, whether they're coming from Canada, Switzerland, Germany, Argentina, that they have successful businesses, 500K revenue, up to $5 million revenue, say, selling mostly in their local market, but maybe they're doing e-commerce or providing some services to the United States. When does it make sense for that founder, that CEO, to himself or herself move to the United States rather than, hiring someone for the US expansion?
I often get that same question, and it boils down to market readiness, really. And what does market readiness mean? Well, first of all, your organization needs to be ready, and you need to be ready. If you as a founder are thinking, anticipating a move to the US, what does that mean for you and your family and loved ones and the organization that you're already running in your existing country? And they operate as well without you? Have you done your succession planning at home and so on? So the whole readiness starts with whoever is coming over. And reluctantly, I often see how new startups tend to move with the management they already have back home. And that's not always the best move. It might be that you want to mix it up and say, well, at least have half of your management team here in the US be Americans.
And probably especially on key sales, people like to buy from people that look like them, that sound like them.
exactly. And it shouldn't be underestimated how long it takes to set up a company and what it involves. It's a big lift, and you need to really have your partners in place for doing that right. You need to have the advisors in place for that, the staffing and the expertise that is required to do this right. It's a competitive situation, so you're not sitting and having downtime doing it. You're still running your home country and the business there, and it can't fail. And the expectations many times when you move to the US by investors are almost unrealistic, where they think that you did so well back in your homeland and it was so easy to go from the first million to the 20th million and so on. So why wouldn't you just step into a bigger market and kill it, right? And it isn't that straightforward. There's so many different moving items that you need to be on top of and manage, and it takes a lot. It takes a village, really. And like I said, it is a little bit worrying when you see the entire senior management keen to make a move and they move out and they leave a vacuum back home, but they also are not really used to how things operate and work here on a day-to-day basis. And that time lag of learning is where the cost of opportunity sits, and that might be the difference between success and failure. So mixing it up right, being really ready both on the founder, having the right type of expectations from everyone, what this move will mean and how soon it'll turn into something bigger and better, and then also having pre-planned all the way through, uh, and not improvise too much, because time is money, and the wrong hire could be fatal, and put you back for 6 months or so. If you're not on top of the tax and legal and compliance, that can be insurance and so on, all these things that take time to get right. And I'm not trying to put a damper on make the move. I'm very much for companies to come over. That's our business. But we also want to make sure that once they're
Right.
here, they're successful.
And tell me a little bit about the U.S. consumer. What are Americans like? How do they vary compared? I know it's generalizing a bit, but compared to Europeans or Latin America and some of these other markets that you have deep experience in.
I mean, there's so many different behaviors that vary, and so many that are similar. But I would say, on the whole, convenience is so much more important in the U.S. for
Oh yeah,
consumers that it has to be a one click away. And if it's 2 clicks, that's a bit of a lift, really. Everything needs also to be digitized on your phone, basically, accessible to that extent. I'm still amazed how many services that you would think were exclusively run on at least a PC platform are entirely run on what is a PC in effect, in computer power, our phones today. And we want to be able to sit and have a pizza and buy and sell shares on Robinhood, and we want to be taking in the news and then making decisions on where we're booking our next hotel and what car and this and that and so on. It's really the convenience that drives so much more than maybe we see back in Europe or we see in Asia and other continents
maybe
where,
more focus on
yes,
quality or pricing rather than convenience.
yeah, pricing and sometimes also other factors that play in. I look at some markets where sustainability has a much more or higher importance on how consumers behave and their actual options that they put in front of themselves. Where here we might think a little bit less about sustainability and the impact it has on general. Price shopping is a funny one because we find that everywhere, right? That's a global
Universal.
consumer team sport. I would say that everyone loves price shopping, and who doesn't love making a bargain and bragging to their friends about, what a bargain you made. But I do find it really interesting how we see bargain hunting differently and how we are very similar in many things. So, a quick example, when I was working in the UK, I was working a lot in France, and I started learning about wine, very basic compared to the wine pros back in France. And the bragging rights they brought home to the table, and the dinner discussions was how little you paid for a really good wine,
It's a
because then
deal.
you really knew what you were
You
doing,
know, yeah.
and then you
You
know
knew better
exactly.
than the market.
Exactly, you're outplaying the market. Whereas I would see in some other less wine-driven countries that I was working, where people would come to the table with a brand wine, if you like, a well-established Bordeaux house,
And they paid for it, but that's
and
fine.
they paid for it, and everyone would say, "Wow," and you only paid $100 for it, and the French people around the table would choke when they heard that. That's crazy.
Joe, could you share some success stories of companies entering the U.S. market and some of the key factors behind their success?
I think that the successes are really come down to what we have covered to some degree, which is the readiness, the expectations, the investors, the founders, really having had some experience before. Many cases, bringing on that experience through advisors, through new board members, through new investors, doing all your homework on the market side. What are you getting yourself into is so important and so underestimated. And really being prepared for things going wrong, because we often are over optimistic in that whatever we set ourselves out to do will go exactly to
Do you
plan.
want
And
to do it otherwise? If you
exactly. But we also know that nothing goes exactly to plan. And that's
no.
just life, right? So having a little bit of leeway and having some advisory around you that can help you operate when things start going off the rails a bit.
I've seen that a lot with foreign franchise brands entering the U.S. market, where they'll set up a board, they'll have advisors, as well as U.S. brands expanding abroad. But them understanding, hey, this is a new market. Maybe there's gonna be a local partner. And that was one thing you mentioned, the investor, which I want to ask you, like, what have you found for startup entrepreneurs, those entering the U.S. market? Is it best, like, in terms of capital for the U.S. market? Like, is it better to, kind of separate it out from the European entity or the South American, Asian entity? Or do you want to rely on those investors from your home market? What have you seen kind of as general has been a good strategy that, has been repeated by some companies?
I think it's always good to have long-term investors on board. And usually the early investors that have stayed with you have become really knowledgeable about your business and been on the journey, so to speak, that they can really operate as a next level advisor in new markets too. And I think that it's a healthy balance and a healthy debate to have. Having been there, done that, they can provide a perspective, but also knowing that this is an entirely different market with different market conditions, some similar, but not all of them. And having that new expert and US investor provide that expertise. And there you have a dynamic board then really has, a good debate and discussion, but it's something that really adds value from both.
Well, Shel, we've covered a lot today. I just wanted to see if there was any items that we left off that you would think are relevant to our audience, of those that, have businesses that have been successful in their local market, or maybe even operating an e-commerce business that's hit 2-3 million, but kind of as stalled with their Amazon store. Any penny advice for those type of entrepreneurs out there?
I would say don't overcomplicate what it means to make that market move, because it's very easy to also overcomplicate and overthink and try to work it out. Of course, don't oversimplify it. I and my work colleagues many times oversimplified and thought, yeah, how hard can it be? Without really doing sufficient groundwork on that fact that I mentioned earlier, that there are 50 USs to move to. So pick those carefully. because moving to France and to Holland is not the same thing. So think about where you're landing first and then your expansion strategy. I think that's really important because once you get good traction in one state, in one market, where do you go to next? And in what order are you moving around? That can really either propel your growth or stymie it and slow it down where that next goes. Because of course, again, don't repeat the mistake that one state success means that you're automatically going to be successful in the same way in another state. There are new market conditions, new things to take into account, new labor situation, talent, what to hire, expectations from investors, and so on. So there's a lot new to come into place. So I think it's the beauty of business. It's always moving. Stay on top of it.
So it resonates a lot because we hear that as like advice from one client to another, where they say, if you can and you have the time to work, remote, take a sabbatical, whatever, go spend the summer in Florida, go spend the summer in Texas, California, wherever. See if your family likes it. See, if you can see making business sense. And that's something that's been repeated, where those that I think are done really well, it was methodical. They didn't just see a city on a map or go on Google, but they spent some measurable time there, got the input too from their spouse and their, the other partners, whether it's in business life or personal life, that this is where we're going to be for the next, 3 to 5+ years.
Yeah, and it's so important what you touch on here, that the market might be a really good fit for the company, but maybe it's not the right family fit. And again, you need to take that into account because, as they say, a happy wife, happy life, right? So
yes.
be careful what you put yourself and your family into before you pull the trigger on that.
Well, Kjell, what's the best way for people to follow you on social media or get in contact if they're interested in maybe having you in terms of consulting capacity, advisory capacity?
Yeah, I mean, the best way probably is to find me on LinkedIn, Kjell De Orr. There is only one so far anyway, so it's pretty easy to find me.
Spelling out KJELL space DE space ORR. And we'll put a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes.
Perfect.
Awesome, Kjell. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure. Take care.